Mayflower II, the 1950s recreation, this time on the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. Want to bring history to life in your classroom? With Everything is a Primary Source to go, you can borrow real historical artifacts from the last 200 years, shipped right to your school. It's hands-on history, paired with ready-to-use lesson plans and classroom activities that make the past come to life for you and your students. Whether you're teaching the Industrial Revolution all the way up through the Communication Revolution, there's something in our collection for every era. Visit everything-history.com/EPS to go and start transforming your teaching today. That's everything-history.com/EPS to go, because history belongs in your hands. Welcome to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, the show where we navigate history through popular culture. I'm your host, Eric Salmonson. I'm a social studies teacher, historian, and pop culture enthusiast. Each episode, I sit down with everyday people to discuss the media, objects, places, and events that shape us and reveal what they say about the past, as well as who we are now. The Everything is a Primary Source podcast is, therefore, your history, my history, our history through popular culture.
I'm really glad to have Richard Stone with me. He is the author of Project Mayflower, Building and Sailing a 17th Century Replica. And I think this is, I couldn't ask for a better person to talk to about, and before I hit record, I was just talking about how I focus on unorthodox primary sources, things that are not traditionally seen as documents of time and place. We're going to be talking about Mayflower II. And you are the perfect person to tell me about it because you quite literally wrote the book on it. Before we dive into the questions about Mayflower II, what was it about that project that brought you to it, that you wanted to write a book about it?
It was strictly by chance. So I had done some work with the people that owned the ship. It's owned by a museum in Massachusetts called Plymouth Patuxent Museums. It used to be called Plymouth Plantation. And a couple years ago, the ship was refurbished, kind of renovated, and it was put back in the water in 2019 in advance of 2020 and the 400th anniversary of the sailing. And someone suggested that I go up to Mystic and meet a person that might be able to tell me something about the ship that I might not already know. And so I went up and introduced myself to a man named Randall Charlton. I said, so Randall, people at the museum say you're an interesting guy and you'll have things to tell me that I may not know about the ship. What's that? He said, well, it's not much. My dad's the one that built it, sailed it to America, and then gave it to the country as a gift from the British on behalf of the British people. But it was my dad who built it, sailed it, and delivered it to America. And I had been in the sports business, and I thought, wow, this is like a sports story where the local team finally wins the state championship. Everybody talks about the quarterback, but they don't talk about the guy that caught the winning pass and made the touchdown. This is kind of like, who is this guy? And so I started, asking more questions of Randall and who his father was. And it struck me as an underdog story. And so here's what turns out to be a British war veteran no one's heard of. And he gets this idea to build a replica of the Mayflower because it just seems like a great adventure. So there are two things going on here. One is that, and a lot of stuff happening at this particular moment in history for your listeners. First of all, this young man, he was in his early 20s when World War II broke out, and he happened to be on the staff of one of Britain's most famous generals, a guy named Bernard Montgomery. He was so famous they gave him a nickname. They called him Monty. And Monty was in North Africa fighting the Germans' most famous general, and one of the most famous, a guy named Erwin Rommel, who had a nickname too, the Desert Fox. So the Desert Fox is taking on Monty, and he is whipping Monty's butt. And Monty's going backwards and needs some help. And the U.S. sent Sherman tanks. This is before we got into the war. No strings attached. They just sent the tanks to help him out. And Charlton thought, wow, without that act of generosity, we would have been in a different spot. Monty was able to take advantage of those tanks, beat Rommel, and it changed the trajectory of the war. Anyway, thereafter, he got transferred to the Pacific region, and he also worked with the most famous British general out there, a guy named Lord Louis Mountbatten, who happens to be the cousin once removed of the former Queen Elizabeth II. And so your listeners may have heard of Queen Elizabeth. So he worked with Queen Elizabeth's uncle and with this really famous general, Monty. The war ends, and he thinks, we should thank America for what it did. I mean, look at the French. The French gave America the Statue of Liberty. What have we given them? What the Brits have given them? A briar pipe, tweed coat. We need to give them something more. We need to give them a gesture of gratitude. And just by happenstance, at that time, there are some grand adventures going on in the world. One of them was the conquering of Mount Everest, which captured the world's attention. Another one was the sailing of a ship called the Kon-Tiki, which opened new answers to how Polynesia might have been inhabited. And he thought, I should have a great adventure. In fact, that great adventure maybe will be a way to thank America. Because what do you give the richest country on earth? What do you give somebody who can buy anything? I know what I'll do. I'll give them a piece of their lost history. I'll rebuild a replica of the ship that sailed in 1620, inspired Thanksgiving, inspired the writing of the first written American Constitution, and we're going to be celebrating that next year in this country. Anyway, so that's what he did, and the story gets more adventurous from there. But it all really happened, and it is kind of a remarkable story that no one knows, because I thought the British government built it. And in fact, the British government, for half the project's life, did their darndest to scuttle the project.
Interesting. I'd be curious as to why that was. I see it as it's a token. It's something that it can actually, because one could argue, and I would, that probably the biggest gift that the British have ever given to America would be, well, culture. We're communicating right now in their language.
Yes.
The model for government, the parliamentary, having a bicameral legislature was something that was appealing to the founders of the country and had already existed in a lot of different colonies during the British time. So I would put it as they gave us a nice running start to establishing, because those colonies, starting with Massachusetts Bay, or more specifically Plymouth, and then that eventually grew into Massachusetts Bay. It's something that I guess that's like the safest one. The thing that you could like token wise, because I can't think of anybody that could identify the ship that the settlers in Jamestown 13 years earlier rode in, came to America on. It'd be hard to say we're going to recreate Jamestown, but with the Mayflower, that is a name of a ship that every school kid in America by the 1950s and even earlier could identify. And so We're going to take that token of history, and it's really the only one that really stands out and is prominent to most Americans that doesn't have any kind of animosity towards it. What you're describing, that post-World War II era, I think modern Americans have gotten too used to this idea of us being on very good terms with the British, having that special relationship that Winston Churchill referred to as. And he himself could have even been seen as a bridging type figure, considering I think it was his mother was American and his father was British. And so, he has this concept of and even before the United States got into World War II, he would give that famous speech of "We will never surrender," and he's saying, and you can understand him because he mumbles a lot and has that very thick accent, but he says something to the effect of, the new world will come to the assistance of the old, where it's only a matter of time before the Americans will enter this conflict just as they did the previous one. And so it's like this Mayflower concept of let's make another Mayflower and let's give it to the Americans. And I know I'm rambling all over the place. Let me see if I can streamline a little bit more.
No, you're doing very well, and I'll pick up on this once we keep going.
Yeah, so we're familiar with that. Post World War II onwards, as far as like we're trading things back and forth with the British constantly and prominently. We know each other's music, we know each other's film stars, we know each other's style of food. It's going back and forth across the Atlantic. But that hasn't always been so. It wasn't something that has always been there for part of. I think it was when the Statue of Liberty was installed in the previous century. The British remarked, they said, "Isn't this perfect?" The French are giving the Americans the Statue of Liberty. Here's France that has too little liberty, and America that has too much. Right? They're kind of looking down their nose at both of their allies. We haven't always had this great relationship in Great Britain, and that was something that came out after World War II. And I can see that the Mayflower, if you're searching through the annals of American-British relationships, and you're like, what can I give them that is not going to be political, that's not going to be bringing attention to negative relations between the country? Oh, the Mayflower.
Well, you hit on all the key points, and I can see why you're a great teacher, because you hit on topics that capture the imagination and are actually central to this story. One of them was why this ship? Why in the world do you remember Mayflower when the first British colony was Jamestown? Why don't people remember that ship? You hit on this idea of, really this concept of language, culture, democracy, all these things we get from the British. And Churchill summarized that in a statement following the war. He said, we're held together by a special relationship. And that became a term that is used to this day. Even when President Trump recently went over to see the king, it was all about this special relationship. So that was something. It's an item that was built with one intention, and then halfway, once it was finally done, constructed, it ended up being used for an entirely different purpose, which is quite remarkable. And then an event happened shortly thereafter that changed the world more than this ship. So going back to the question, why in the world do you remember this ship rather than any one of the thousands, tens of thousands of other English ships that came to this country, this continent, starting in the 1600s with increasing frequency? But why did they remember this ship? Jamestown, Plymouth. Jamestown was a commercial venture. It was a business proposition. And the objective was to make a profit, return profits to England. The colony failed, and so it kind of didn't leave much of a mark. The people in the north, from the Jamestown is like 1607, 1608, something like that, 1607. And so 13 years later, you have these pilgrims. They head out to America with a different reason. And the ship itself, it's a beat up commercial ship. So I said to somebody, they originally started with two ships. They had a ship called the Mayflower and another one called the Speedwell. And I said, I was like my buddy, I said, this is like us saying, let's take a road trip. Let's go from New York to L.A., and I got a minivan, and you have a minivan, and the other one breaks down. So the people in the second minivan, which is the Speedwell, half of you can come with us, the other half have to stay. So they got all these people crammed onto this little ship called the Mayflower. Mayflower sets out. gets delayed. So instead of leaving in the spring and summer when the weather's good, it left in the fall. And it's now going across the North Atlantic in late autumn. It takes 66 days in this little ship, and it gets lost, and it lands in Cape Cod, outside of the territory that's controlled by the king, King James I, who, by the way, did not like being criticized. If you criticized him, that was considered sedition, punishable by death. So the ship finally arrives in Plymouth. So half the people on it we recall as being these people in search of religious freedom, but the other half were just regular Joes looking for opportunity in the New World. So they had two different groups. Let's say a religious, I used to call them saints and sinners. So you have these two groups. They've been stuck on this little ship for 66 days. How little is this little ship? So imagine being in a conference room that might be 25 feet wide and 100 feet long. That was the size of the ship. Put 140 people in that room. No water, no electricity, no internet, nothing. No heat for 66 days. So by the end of it, they're now pretty testy and starting to get at each other's throats. They land in Plymouth, and they decide, once we step on the shore after these 66 days, we could go our separate ways. So we need to agree now, because we're beyond the jurisdiction of the king, the king who says you can't criticize him. Well, now we're in a place where we can, but we have to agree that they would write down that they would agree to disagree. So they looked at the 100 people in this room. They just got the men in this particular section because it was that long ago. And they said, look, we're going to agree to disagree. And we're going to form ourselves into we're kind of a body of people here. Let's give it a name. Instead of calling it a bunch of guys, a body of guys, let's call it a body politic. We're going to call our group the body politic. That'll be our group. And what do we want this group to do? Well, we can't agree on much, but we do agree that we would like just and equal laws for the general good, for all of us. So they decide how they would form this group, this body politic, and they would do many things, but the overall goal was to have a system where you could have just and equal laws for the general good. And they wrote that down, and that became known subsequently as the Mayflower Compact. 150 years later, one of the great-great-grandsons of one of the survivors was with another group of guys in Philadelphia, and they wrote the Declaration of Independence and subsequently the U.S. Constitution. So we remember Mayflower both because it survived, but because they put those words on a piece of paper. When Charlton originally got the idea to build this ship, it was going to be a great adventure because he saw the world liked great adventures. And so this was fun. It was going to celebrate America's past history. Well, halfway through the construction of the ship, that special relationship that you referred to earlier at the beginning of this was summarily dismissed and thrown into the toilet by the British. That's because the British, in cahoots with the French and the Israelis, went behind the U.S. government and started a war in the Middle East that became known as the Suez Crisis. It was our first war in the Middle East, and we're still dealing with those. They didn't tell Ike. And Eisenhower was running for his second term as the peace candidate. Boy, was he ticked. He interrupted his campaigning, went on television and said, listen, I didn't know what these guys were doing. They shouldn't have done it. He's reelected. Once he is reelected, he tells the British they have to get out of the Middle East. They do. Their relationship falls apart, and the whole world can see it's falling apart. And they need some symbol. They need an emoji. We all know emojis. They needed an old-fashioned emoji, a symbol where people could see it, either the symbol of it or see a picture of it and go, I know what that is. And that became the Mayflower. He thought, if I could build this ship, which honors that special relationship that Churchill talked about and was on kind of teetering, and I can sail it across the seas, the international press will follow it. It'll become an international news sensation. And they did. And when it landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts in June of 1957, a young congressman at the time, Senator, a guy named Jack Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, was running for re-election. He thought, I'll start a little bit early on the presidential campaign. He was in Plymouth, took time off of his routine, went down to the ship, and had a photo taken of himself and several of the crew guys at the wheel of Mayflower II, guiding in spirit, guiding the nation. A few weeks later, it is now July 4th, 1957. 2 days earlier, the Mayflower had sailed into New York Harbor. Spectacular moment. It's the cover of my book. National Geographic's most famous photographer of the era, a guy named B. Anthony Stewart, took the photo, and it was declared the photo of the century. Of course, we know there are much more famous photos since then.
Yeah, but it's kind of early to call a photo of the century.
They were pretty bold. But 2 days later, JFK read the entire Declaration of Independence. It runs about 13 minutes from start to finish, and went in the course of human events, and it's fabulous. He loved the Mayflower, and he loved the what it stood for. So where that comes now to current times, he liked it so much that people saw his affection for tall ships, New York Harbor. They decided to organize what would become known as Operation Sail. Tall ships, not just the Mayflower and lots of other ones, would come back in the summer of 1964. Unfortunately, Kennedy got assassinated before that happened. And, as you were saying, when you and I, before we got on this thing, we're just, noting the anniversary of his assassination. But those tall ships, when they come back into New York Harbor next summer, it's really in honor of all the history of this country that's tied to the sea, but also in honor of JFK and his belief in that Declaration of Independence that he read to the people of New York many years ago.
He definitely was he was very much, he had a lot of adoration for history, of all history, but the country's history in particular. I know his Profiles in Courage book, in which he covers the history of many Americans, of different time periods. When president, he was the one who created which still exists now, get the exact name for them, but they
even before
the Fife and Drum Corps, the people that wear the tricorner caps, and and they do. I think it's called the First Army. They were created by JFK as a way to connect once again with the country's past, and I think these are all, strangely, very much post-World War II, kind of like gestures. Like it wouldn't have happened. He was, other than Eisenhower, who was he's the general in World War II. Kennedy he was in World War II as a veteran of the war, and identified correctly, with other veterans of the war. He was actually a fighting man more so than Eisenhower was. And he's, I believe, the first president born in the 20th century, if I'm not mistaken. And so he kind of has this position of, I think that's why there's so much excitement about his presidency in the first place. This younger guy, has this deep affection for the past, but is also looking to the future. He's maybe interested in this wooden Mayflower, but he's also interested in putting rockets onto the moon. Well, you don't bring the rocket part, but yeah, you know what I mean. Putting man on the moon. He has this perfect reach in both directions, and it fits the time period so well from the top down. And it seems like it's being shared on the other side of the Atlantic too, where it's like, okay, let's give ourselves challenges. We have just shown that we can handle our culture, our democratic ways, just demonstrated that they are superior to authoritarian, totalitarian countries in that last war. Let's prove what we can do on this world stage with these very virtuous things. And so that's the top visionary type thing going on in the 1950s. So ground level, on the everyday ordinary people type level, a lot of that excitement after World War II was turned into the form of, hey, let's go on road trips. We have all this time. Dad has an office job now. He doesn't work, six days a week. He works only 5, and we have all this extra money. Let's go on road trips. Hey, where should we go? I don't know. Let's celebrate American history. Let's go to this Plymouth plantation place, and let's go to Colonial Williamsburg, that was created, before the war. It's like you have this overall American culture that's doing the same thing, looking back into its past, but also forward into the future. And I think Mayflower II is just kind of like the nice little cherry on top of the, at least for Plymouth anyway, their Sunday.
Engaging students with authentic learning experiences is essential to being an effective teacher. Here's the 2026 New Hampshire Teacher of the Year, Megan Philbrook, speaking about her experience with my primary source borrowing service, EPS2Go, which aims to do just that.
Going above just our standards is really, really important to grab our learners and engage them. And I think that's what your kits really do. It's a museum in a box that comes to your classroom that makes our teaching lives so much easier. So once I had my first taste of your kits, I knew that there's something here that we social studies teachers really need to draw upon more. So that finalist visit is your last round to kind of show off and showcase what you can do and why you should be New Hampshire Teacher of the Year. And with my primary source kit, I would like to think, of course, that I definitely wowed the selection committee. There was just something in there for every single person that came to visit, and my students were right in the history, and you couldn't ask for more.
If you'd like to learn more about how EPS2Go can bring an authentic history experience directly to your classroom, visit everything-history.com/EPS2Go today.
So just, you had mentioned Kennedy and putting a man on the moon. That whole initiative, which is really, putting a man-made object into space, that's what triggered that whole thing. And the Russians were the first to do it. It was called Sputnik, and that happened 5 months after Mayflower. So in this year of 1957, which is still before the Beatles, in the spring of 57, you have the world looking back, celebrating this Mayflower voyage from 1620. Within months, the world changes. And a new era of scientific discovery is introduced when Sputnik, which weighed about 180 pounds, about the size of a large beach ball, was put into Earth orbit. That changed the world. And another thing that changed the world again that was happening at the same time, and you mentioned Churchill and the special relationship, when he spoke those words in a manner that everybody remembered for the first time. It was in Missouri following the war in 1946. He talked about 2 things that were going on simultaneously. It was the International Press Corps was there. Truman was there, the president. And he said, gentlemen, 2 big things are happening. The first is an iron curtain is falling across Europe, where the communist governments are trying to crush the forces of democracy. The Iron Curtain. He then said, but there is a counterbalance to that, a special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada that will defend the world from democracy. So those 2 moments, communism, being seen as a threat, the Iron Curtain, and the special relationship became central. As we think of events today, you read the newspaper today, and there's in the headlines, we read about Ukraine. So Ukraine has been fighting the Russians now for several years. In 1957, a month after this ship was launched, the same thing happened. Russia saw England and France start a war in the Middle East. We know where that's gone. A month after that, Russia invaded its neighbor, Hungary, and crushed an effort to introduce democracy to that group. It was the first uprising in the post-World War II era against Soviet domination. And so you think of Ukraine, You think of what we did then. You think of Hungary. You think of the Middle East, and you think of using tariffs. So tariffs we now use to try to influence another country's foreign policy. That concept was introduced kind of on steroids when Eisenhower called the British Prime Minister the day after he was elected and said, look, if you want us to help you financially, you need to change your foreign policy. You need to get out of the Middle East and abandon the French. And so events happening today have their roots in the era, 1957, when the ship was sailing. Again, the ship's purpose changed. Originally designed and built to look retrospectively at history. How have we gotten here? Isn't it wonderful? And shifting to look prospectively forward. How do we go forward to navigate this? How do we maintain this special relationship? And I think as we look at this, the next year coming forth, America 250, where you talk about the Declaration of Independence and all of that, it's very relevant to this because many people consider that Mayflower Compact to be the first written American Constitution. And of course, the 250th celebration next year is to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. But then it took 11 years before they wrote the Constitution. They wrote the Declaration in 76. They write the U.S. Constitution in 87. So it doesn't happen overnight, but the roots of that, kind of the prequel to American independence, go back to 1620 in this voyage.
It's just I think it's pretty interesting to think that a wooden ship could be a almost like a playing piece on a board game in the Cold War. You always think about the U-2 spy planes and of course the space race, and you think about the arms race that was going on, big hydrogen bombs being developed and things. But a wooden ship is being demonstrated as, well, this is how our history of the Atlantic started. And this is a relationship that we still have that's going to, I like that term, counterbalance you and your development. I don't know if you're familiar with the movie Rocky IV.
Yes.
But it kind of has it shows itself in that I think it's the greatest movie montage ever made when you see Rocky training and Ivan Drago training, and the Russians have all these scientists and military men with hooking all these machines to Ivan Drago, and then meanwhile Rocky is pulling his friends on a cart and he's lifting up rocks and throwing them down mountains and stuff, and it's that's the American / British way. Get your hands dirty, democratic, freedom loving, and then here's the Soviet way, right? Here's the Soviets with their, putting all their best minds and money and everything towards their weapons, right? So I just think it's so fitting for the time to say, hey, this thing's going to be a symbol of us and the way that we spread out from our island nation, and it's so much, I don't know, it's pure anyway.
You're correct, and it's made of wood. So when you think of the power of an idea, the durability of an idea, so the United Kingdom not only inspired the United States, but you also look at the other countries: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, Singapore. They have a great legacy globally of laying the foundation where the people in those then colonies were able to weave their own histories going forward. We, of course, wove our own history, which turned out to be quite dramatic and wonderful. But the power of an idea and nurturing it, I think, is important. You're hitting it spot on. That is our strength. Again, ripping things from the headlines, you look at the David and Goliath, little old Ukraine and mighty Soviet Union. One is powered by an idea, and the other one is powered by greed, ambition, and things that would be described as part of those 7 deadly sins.
I want to ask, and we already talked about Plymouth Patuxent a little bit, but of course I would imagine that Plymouth that was opened in the late 1940s was inspired by the success of Colonial Williamsburg, which is the colonial capital for Virginia, which stemmed from Jamestown. So it's, that rivalry, if you will, between Virginia, Jamestown, and Williamsburg, and Massachusetts, with, in this case, Plymouth, continues in the 1950s and beyond, right? And these locations that are associated with it. Do you think that the actual physical place, at least for the American interests, there was two parties involved in trying to get this project done, Project Mayflower, Mayflower II. You had the British officer who was interested in it, but the American side, was it as a way, potentially, even just subconsciously, to kind of outpace their Virginia, Colonial Williamsburg counterparts and be like, well,
No.
we have a ship?
No. The so Harry Hornblower II, Harry, he had the vision since he was in high school to start a colonial history museum in New England. And as you rightly said, kind of modeled on the Williamsburg concept, where you would have a docent, a costume docent, really an actor. You come to the museum, you go to the exhibit, and there's a live drama there. It's really the person saying, I'm here, I live here, and they're trying to be so convincing to you that you've met someone dropped in from a time capsule from 1600s, and the same thing with Colonial Williamsburg. That was the concept, and as he moved forward with that, he initially built the Plymouth, the colony, what they call Plymouth Plantation, and he realized the story of that began with the ship. And so he decided, and his backers, we really should try to get an artifact or a ship as part of the land-based, the colonial village, which goes hand in glove. You got the ship, you got the village, you go side by side. They just happen to be simultaneous undertakings by the Americans, Harry Hornblower, and the Brits, Warwick Charlton. They met by chance, had very different backgrounds. But when they did meet, they said, we should join forces and try to get this done, which is what they did. And again, their very different backgrounds were. Harry was the son of a wealthy New Englander. His grandfather founded one of the top financial firms on Wall Street at the time, Hornblower and Weeks. Charlton, in contrast, didn't even have a bank account until about a year or so before this project began. But he had a big idea. So one had a big idea and drive. The other one had a big wallet and a place where he'd like to invest a replica of the Plymouth, of the ship. So very different backgrounds. Hornblower knew that to build something you needed plans, and so he hired a very renowned and outstanding naval architect named William Baker, who made plans for this ship, and the plans were then donated to the Brits, and they did. The British said, listen, we will finance, construct, and sail the ship to America, and in return, you're going to provide housing, maintenance, and exhibition. That was the deal, and it worked out.
If I was going to be, this might be stereotypical, but if I was to guess which of those two names, Charlton or Hornblower, was the British name, I would guess Hornblower, but he's actually the American one.
Right, but he also
sounds very English. I'm assuming his history is English, his heritage probably.
So Hornblower, his family went way back. They had been in New England for ages, and but he didn't realize that he died before it was learned that he was a descendant of one of the original signers of the Mayflower Compact, a guy named Hopkins, and Stephen Hopkins. And so he had connections, but and of course there's a great fictional hero called Horatio Hornblower, who was a seafaring captain, CF Forester, hugely popular for ages. So actually when they launched the ship, Harry sent a note to the folks in England saying, congratulations from H. Hornblower. And everybody in the crowd starts to cheer and laugh. And they're thinking, Horatio Hornblower. Yeah. Somehow this fictional character has shown up. But it's not. It's just Harry needs a boat, needs that ship.
That's fine. Well, like I was saying, I worked at a living history museum. And one of the times that we had a conference there of living history, what we call first-person role players, what we call ourselves. When the Plymouth Plantation people, Plymouth Patuxent Museum people came to the conference, it was almost like, well, I'll put it this way. It was cool because one of the keynote speakers was the guy who played George Washington at Williamsburg. So it was like the all-stars. And then we had the Plymouth Plantation people were like, wow, you set the standard, because each of those kinds of museums has its own set of rules. Ours followed the Plymouth rules, and that was we cannot leave our time period. So I was in 1777, Revolutionary War Tavern, and I would routinely be able to size up people's understanding of the Revolutionary era when they walked in. Some people thought that I was a pilgrim, so they're about 150 years off. Other times people thought that I was a pirate, which I don't know why. But, and who was always the group that as soon as they saw me, started talking to me and not trying to get me to break character or anything like that? It was always British people. British tourists were fantastic. They just put themselves right into the time period, and we're totally comfortable doing that. And I'm kind of curious, maybe this is all kind of like folds together into something that, and I've been to England, so I can confirm that it's not just one whole island of people role playing as in the 18th century. So it's not something that happens everywhere, but I think it's just something to do. Maybe it's their theatrical past as a culture, people are just interested in that kind of thing, or maybe it's just their overall respect for that idea of like, you are trying to depict history, you are trying to depict the past, and so we appreciate that. And I'll just end this little segment by saying, and this connects directly to the Mayflower. In character, I was talking to a British woman one time, and I was talking about that we're connected, that our heritage is the same, because I knew that the family that I was representing was a real family, and the father had come from England in his own lifetime. So, she said, well, you're the courageous ones because you left. And I thought that, I'm like, that is so true, that the people who, especially in 1620, when there's absolutely nothing to assure you that you're going to be all right. And in fact, history proved that it wasn't all right for the vast majority of the people that arrived in that year to what we now call Plymouth, Massachusetts. It did take a lot of courage. And perhaps that's what Charlton was thinking about too, that he was looking at the Americans in the war with all of their courage. For America could have easily stayed out of that conflict, could have easily stayed out of the First World War, but didn't. They showed a lot of courage, and he wanted to perhaps give him a symbol of that courage by giving him the Mayflower. Do you think there's anything to that way of thinking?
Yes, that is it. He thought this is a gift to the veterans, and their families, their mothers, sisters, children. Thanking them for us just stepping forward. You're right. They didn't have. We had two vast oceans on either side of us. I mean, the Japanese, picked the fight in Pearl Harbor, and then after that, we, entered the war with Germany. There had been a lot of shipping that had been lost in the Atlantic, but again, it's like a brush fire. You can see the fire coming. It's consuming all of your friends and family, all your neighbors' houses. The wind is blowing towards you. It's only a matter of time until your house is ablaze. So it's better to start acting before that happens, which is why we entered the war as we did. And luckily, we had a decisive impact on that.
Well, I need to thank you for your time today, because I think that my way of thinking about primary sources is not always an easy mindset to get into and to understand. So I appreciate you adding your incredible expertise about the Mayflower II project and trying to match it up with my style of seeing everything as a primary source. I'm curious, in all of your research and all the things that you did to get this story into print, what was your biggest surprise? What was something that you came across, whether it be a letter, a photograph? I saw in there you had a list of all the sponsors, people that provided food and different equipment for the ship. When you were doing your research, what was the biggest surprise that you came across about this whole project?
The biggest surprise was a secret meeting between President Eisenhower and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan that was kept, the contents of the meeting, the subject matter was kept secret from the spring of 1957 until the publication of my book. That was the biggest surprise.
Wow.
So what happened is they had a meeting. They had a conference in Bermuda. It was called the Bermuda Conference. And all the world press was following it because the U.S. and Britain were trying to make up, given the rupture in relationships following the Suez Crisis. And the two leaders met twice in private. And on the at the end of the second meeting, on the 22nd of March, as they're leaving, Eisenhower goes, "Listen, Harold, before you leave, there are three topics that I think we are most important. I just got to get them off my chest to make sure we've covered them properly. One is NATO. NATO has kept the peace since the end of World War II, and it's essential that the two of us, Britain and America, keep a strong NATO. Secondly, we have to talk about nuclear weapons. Nuclear proliferation, nuclear weapons are a subject that could be the scourge of the world. We need to be together on that. And by the way, there's a third topic, this special relationship with us. The world thinks it's gone into the toilet. We got to fix this up." And sitting in the room with them happened to be the British foreign minister. And he leans across the table and says, "Well, we just happen to be working on something like that. It doesn't involve any nuclear material, but if it pays out, it'll have big dividends. We call it the scheme." So, the Brits, a lot of people don't like to call things what they are. Like, we never called the atomic bomb the bomb. It was the gadget. Well, the British called the Project Mayflower the scheme. So Eisenhower now hears about this scheme from the British foreign minister. When he returns to his office, a couple days later, there's a letter waiting for him from the chief of staff of none other than Bernard Montgomery, Monty's chief of staff, who knew Eisenhower from the days in the desert. I mean, they worked very closely together during the war. He said, "Ike, I just want you to know the scheme has come to fruition. Mayflower II sets sail in a few weeks. I've agreed to be part of it. I thought you'd want to know." And so in the middle of the voyage to the U.S., in the middle of the Atlantic, middle of nowhere, and out of the blue arrived 3 U.S. destroyers by order of Washington, one of which drops a launch over the side. They send over a boat. They gather photographs that can be used to promote the event once it gets here. And then, of course, when the ship does arrive in New York Harbor, what's sailing above them, and you can see them on the cover of my book, and in the picture behind me is a U.S. Navy blimp. So the utility of this piece of wood floating in the water turned out to be much greater than talking about past sacrifice. It really had to do with future common efforts and keeping the world safe for democracy. That was the biggest surprise to me, that secret meeting.
I'm just like, thank you for sharing with my audience. And that's such a brilliant. That seems like that's what hinges everything here. It's like that maybe that meeting is what turned just somebody's project into something much greater.
It changed the tide of this thing. You're exactly correct. Because when they got back, where people may have said, "Well, it's just a skit, it's like, it's a publicity stunt," it's that all the comments that may have had any negative connotation were dropped. They were now all rowing in the same direction. Let's get this guy in the water. Let's get him out there. Let's leverage this this adventure for diplomatic purposes. That was the most amazing thing for me.
Richard A. Stone, thank you so much for joining me on the Everything's Primary Source podcast. If people want their own copy of Project Mayflower, what's the best place to get it? This is, after all, the holiday shopping season's begun, I think.
Holiday shopping season. It is available wherever books are sold. It's you can buy it on Amazon and any bookstore, Barnes & Noble. It's published by Lyons Press. It's distributed in both hardback and ebook by Simon & Schuster. And the audio edition of the book should be released by the end of this year. And thus you'll be able to either listen to the book or read it in a ebook format like a Kindle or something, or a hard copy. But wherever books are sold in this country or in Europe, it's sold in the UK and in Australia. So if you happen to be a listener in Canada, go to your local bookstore and they'll have it also. Which by itself, that was pretty amazing to me. I guess the biggest thing amazing to me is that the Imperial War Museum in London, where they keep the Churchill Library is, they cite this book as offering a new insight into the Suez Crisis. And the Greenwich Maritime Museum, part of the Royal Museums of London, was among the first people to get a copy of the book and put it in their catalog, which was pretty stunning to me. But people do like the book. It's nonfiction. It's thoroughly documented. The bibliography is there. It's and the people that have read it seem to like what they've read. So I hope your listeners decide to get a copy or find it in the public library. I think they'll enjoy the story.
I enjoyed the story behind the story, as it were. So thank you again for joining me on the Everything's Primary Source podcast.
Thank you.
Popular culture, by definition, connects and unites us, and proves that people of different backgrounds, in fact, have a lot in common with one another. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, at least in part, for that reason. If it connects with you and you'd like to add to it, or any of the podcast episodes, just visit everything-history.com and search for the Everything is a Primary Source project, which can be found in the classroom section of the website. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Be sure to rate and share this podcast wherever you are listening to it now, and follow Everything as a Primary Source on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.